Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I want to talk about a short book by a 19th century French revolutionary called Luois August Blanqui. And this short book, called in French L'éternité par les astres, is translated into English as Eternity by the Stars. Eternity by the Stars. And this translation is by my Leiden colleague Frank Chouraki. So, Blanqui was a revolutionary, and in this particular case, I think it's interesting to know a little bit about the biography of the author before delving into the text itself. So, Blanqui was basically an anarchist. He was somebody who really opposed the existing social institutions of his time, and one would imagine almost every other type of social institution, as long as it generated any kind of injustice and inequality. And Blanqui was not a thinker who was sort of locking himself up in a room somewhere doing the theoretical work. He was out there on the barricades, and people, other people who wanted to change society maybe liked him, but the people in charge didn't like him. And he was imprisoned several times. He was actually condemned to death twice, but never executed. And then, let go again, arrested again, imprisoned again, and so on. By the time he's writing this book, it's 1871. He's a bit older. He's about 46, 47, something like that, I think. And he has been once again imprisoned, this time in a kind of fortress that's standing on a small island out in the sea. I mean, they really didn't want him to come back and stir up more trouble. And so he's there in a cell, and he's got some books, and he's able to do some writing. He is probably reflecting on all his failed attempt at revolution. And he is reading some cosmology. He's reading some natural science. And reading this natural science brings him to reflections about infinity and about what the infinity of the universe, which he most powerfully believes in, what the infinity of the universe means for us human beings. And it's fairly interesting. And according to some people, it might be an influence on Nietzsche's slightly later ideas of eternal recurrence. But I'm not going to talk about Nietzsche in this video. We're just going to talk about Blanqui. Okay, so what's the idea? Well, let's start with the cosmological part. And Blanqui has a lot to say about different things, including hypotheses about comets and stuff like that I'm not going to go into. I'm not going to go and try to give you a sort of detailed overview of his scientific claims or the science of the 18th and 19th century that he is engaging with. In part because I don't know the details. I have no idea what the 18th and 19th century debates about comets looked like. And in part because Blanqui, he's not very strong as a natural scientist. So to give you just one example, at some point he chastises other thinkers for not explaining the nature of centrifugal force in the solar system. Right? And so he says, look, there's gravity pulling the planets towards the sun, but there must also be a force that pulls them away from the sun, because otherwise they would just fall into the sun, and nobody is explaining that force, or at least this author isn't explaining that force, which is just a basic misunderstanding of Newton. Right? There's only one force. It pulls the planets towards the sun, but the planet is already moving. And because it's moving and being pulled, its motion is going to be an ellipse around the sun. There's no second force. Okay, so Blanqui as a scientist, he's not very good. But what's interesting is that he takes some of these scientific ideas that are out there in his time, and he thinks through how they relate to infinity, and also what that means for us, our lives, and, maybe how we feel about those lives. So, let's start with the infinity. Blanqui basically assumes that time and space are eternal. Well, that time is eternal and space is infinite. Right? If you go to the past, it goes on forever. If you go into the future, it goes on forever. If you go through space, it goes on forever. There's an infinite amount of space. That might not be 100% what we, or what natural science tells us today. When it comes to the past, natural science seems to claim that there's a beginning of time in the past. Natural science is basically, I think, silent on whether space is finite or infinite. There's a very famous ancient argument claiming that space has to be infinite because otherwise you would have a kind of limit somewhere. Well, what happens when you reach the limit? Right? If you can pass through it, there must be more space behind it. If you can't pass through it, there must be a thing behind it that's stopping you. Well, it's certainly very hard to think of space as sort of ending, just ending somewhere. 20th century physics has made us think that, maybe the universe could be sort of circular in space. Well, that's something that's possible in general relativity. But it makes sense, at least. It makes sense to think with Blanqui that space is infinite. It makes also sense to think with Blanqui that future time will be infinite. And at least for the sake of argument, let's assume for a moment that Blanqui is also right that past time is infinite. Actually, I think he only needs either space or time. Right? So we can kind of forget about time and just claim that space is infinite, or kind of forget about space and just claim that time is infinite. Either of them is going to give him what he needs. Because what he needs for his argument is the idea that, let's say, space-time, not a term that he uses, but space-time is infinite. Right? There's infinite room in it. Okay, so that's one idea, one premise. There's infinite room that's got to be filled up. Right? I mean, there's got to be things in that. Or maybe it's empty. But Blanqui doesn't think it's empty, because here is the second thing he believes. He believes that all of space and time is going to be roughly the way that space and time is here and now. Right? Not on Earth. Of course, around Earth there's a lot of empty space and then planets and suns and more suns and galaxies and so on. But Blanqui is going to assume that, this idea of there all being galaxies with stars and planets, that's roughly how things are everywhere. That's roughly how things are everywhere, because first of all, for him, it doesn't really make sense that there would be like a very special place in space where there is stuff, and then there are other places, like infinitely many places where there's nothing. I mean, that doesn't really make sense to him. And also because he thinks there's just not a lot of variety. So one of the scientific facts that he likes to return to again and again is spectral analysis. So looking at the light of stars and finding out about spectral lines has shown us that the stars consist of the same elements that the Earth consists of. And so what we've seen, according to Blanqui, is, that nature is pretty uniform. Right? There's a bunch of stuff that you can make things of, the elements, and the Earth is made of them, but the stars seem to be made of just the same stuff. Right? And so Blanqui is going to assume a kind of uniformity throughout the universe. Always and everywhere, things are made out of the same stuff. Wherever you go, there are just these elements. And he gives us a list of the elements, 60-something elements. And he says maybe there are a bit more. Let's say there are 100. It doesn't matter. He could have 1,000. He could have 1,000,000. As long as there's a finite number of elements, Blanqui is good to go. So what do we have? We have an infinite space-time. We have a kind of uniformity. Right? Things are roughly the same everywhere. And there's a limited number of elements. And if there's a limited number of elements, Blanqui tells us, then there is a limited number of things that you can build out of those elements. A huge number of things. I mean, think of all the ways that, let's say, the Earth could have been slightly different, or a bit more different, or even more different. There's an incalculable amount of ways that you can put the elements that we have, the atoms that we have together to form a planet. But incalculable doesn't mean infinite. There's a finite amount of room for a planet, and there's a finite number of elements, and Blanqui never goes into whether space is discrete or continuous, but let's assume that like very small displacements of atoms make no difference. And then there's a finite amount of ways in which you can combine them. And so there is a finite amount of planets, right? There's a finite amount of different planets. Huge, like incalculably huge, but finite. And that brings us to the crucial conclusion that Blanqui is going to draw from his cosmological assumptions. If space is infinite, and let's say time is also infinite, if it's roughly uniform, and if there's only a finite amount of ways that stuff can combine, then space and time cannot be filled with unique situations everywhere. If there's only a finite amount of possibilities that we have for combining matter, but we have to fill an infinite space and time, then we have to use those combinations again and 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 again, and in fact, infinitely many times. If something can be built out of matter, Blanqui tells us, then it must exist somewhere, and not just once, but infinitely many times. There are some subtleties here that if we wanted to do a sort of really more like mathematical or scientific exploration of this idea, I would like to go into. The idea that infinite sequences maybe never have to repeat and so on. But I think, like, as a sort of plausible, at least, plausible claim, there is really something to what Blanqui is telling us here. If matter can come together in only a finite amount of ways, but the universe is infinite, well, then all those ways in which matter actually can come together have to be repeated infinitely many times. So, there's no infinite variety in things, but there's infinite room for things, and therefore everything happens infinitely many times in exactly identical ways. So, the Earth as we have it right now, right, with a philosopher called Victor Gijsbers, telling you about a revolutionary French guy in the 19th century called Blanqui, while wearing a dinosaur sweater made by his wife. That has happened before. It will happen again. In fact, it has happened infinitely many times before. It will happen infinitely many times in the future. And it is happening infinitely many times throughout space right now. That is the picture that Blanqui is giving us. Right? And you can see why people say it has something to do with Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence. Okay, so that's Blanqui's idea. So what happens, sort of philosophically, when you take this seriously, this cosmological hypothesis? Well, one thing that happens is that the possible, the actual, and the necessary kind of seem to become the same thing. If something can happen, it's happening. It's happening infinitely many times, and it has to happen, both now and in the past and in the future. So we have something that Blanqui doesn't call it this way, but I, using philosophical terminology, can call it this way. There is a kind of modal collapse, right? The actual, the possible, and the necessary sort of become the same thing. And of course, we tend to think in terms of what is actual, possible, necessary, and they have very different meanings for us. So if they collapse, then we probably have to rethink our lives, maybe, or the way that we relate to the universe. So everything that we do has already been done infinitely many times and is being done infinitely many times. But also, Blanqui says, everything that we don't do, right? Everything that we haven't done or haven't become, but that we could have done or could have become, that is also happening somewhere, right? There are all these Earths that are just slightly different from ours. And whatever way they are, they must exist, and they must exist infinitely many times. They're real. And so, it was possible that I, this morning, standing before my shelves, I could have chosen a different sweater, right? And so there must be Earths where I am giving this same lecture but wearing a different sweater. And there must be Earths where I am not giving this lecture at all because I decided to do something else today. And there must be Earths where I never became a philosopher. And there must be Earths where I was never born, but somebody else was born, and so on and so forth, right? All the possibilities, as long as it's consistent with how matter behaves, all of them must exist. and in fact must exist infinitely many times. So, on the one hand, that makes the world very rich, right? I mean, all those possibilities that I had and I didn't take them, maybe I feel very melancholic about that. Oh, if only I could also have been this and that, or could also have done that and that. Well, in a sense, I'm doing it, right? I mean, not me here on this earth, but there's some other earth out there where I'm doing it. So maybe that feels like we've suddenly been given a great wealth, right? We've suddenly been enriched. And there is a strand in Blanqui's text where he suggests that might be how we think about it, right? We might try to think about it like that. There might be a kind of consolation of infinity, and the consolation is that, everything that was possible happened. So even if something went wrong, there's someplace else where it went right. Or if you have experienced something that was really great, it's going to continue happening, right? I mean, again and again and again, that experience is going to come back in the universe of you experiencing that greatness. But there's also a dark side to this infinity, and I think the dark side definitely predominates in the text of Blanqui. So here's one element of darkness. It's what Blanqui calls the sort of terrible isolation of the worlds. So here I am, and there are all these other people just like me. But I can't get to them because the distances are immense, right? And there are so many possible planets that the distances, it's not that there are other planets probably in this galaxy or even in a nearby galaxy or even in a visible galaxy, right? It might be way beyond that there's another Earth like ours with people like you and me. So yeah, I can think that, there's this other person who is just like me, but I can never reach them, right? They're too far away. And one of the things that Blanqui thinks about is, he says, look, it would be so great if we could sort of warn them, if we could teach them the lessons that we've learned, so that they don't do the foolish things that we did. But we can't, right? There's no way to get there. And there's another way in which these worlds are isolated. They're isolated because they don't know about each other, right? I mean, human beings are living there and they don't realize that there are all these other worlds. Well, okay, says Blanqui, of course, at some point in the 19th century, when somebody called Blanqui comes around, I suppose, that's when they learn it. But even then, I mean, who on this earth is going to believe him? Well, not a lot of people are sort of following Blanqui. So it's... And even if people do learn it, it will be forgotten again, right? So the universe is going to sort of, when the Earth dies or the solar system dies or whatever, any knowledge that we have is going to disappear. And, new Earths are going to spring up, but they start from the same ignorance. They start from the same not knowing that there are all these other worlds. So there's an isolation of space and an isolation of ignorance. Well, that's a little bit dark. And here's another thing that's very dark, I think, especially for someone like Blanqui, the social revolutionary who is fighting for justice all his life. It's that there is no progress. There can't be progress. Everything that happens is going to happen again and again and again and again. Right? This infinite universe where everything that is possible is happening seems in some ways extremely dynamic. Because, wow, there's all these worlds and they're dying and being born again and planets and suns and it goes on and on and on and on forever. In one sense, it's very dynamic. In another sense, it is the most static place there is. Everything that is possible is already there and will always remain. Yeah, it's going to die, but it's going to pop up again infinitely many times through space and infinitely many times through time. You're sort of stuck in reality, which in essence, which in sort of essentially, is always going to remain the same. It's never going to change. There will be no progress. We will always return again and again and again to the same states of ignorance, injustice, cruelty, and so on and so forth. So, I think this can sort of feel sad on a personal level. There's a beautiful line from a Leonard Cohen song where he sings about all the things that sort of are really bad, that could be really bad about the world. And then he says, well, no one that you hurt can ever heal, right? That would be really bad. If no one that you hurt can ever heal, right? Then your guilt is sort of infinite. You hurt someone, they can't heal, it's horrible, right? Your guilt is infinite. Well, but that's the truth in this infinite universe, at least in the sense that whenever you hurt someone, it's gonna happen infinitely many times, right? I mean, it's there forever in the universe. And it's also true, of course, at the larger scale of social situations, of societal injustices. So, for Blanqui, I think, this idea of infinity, even though he tries to put a little bit of a brave face on it, in the end is a very dark idea. It means that we're stuck in reality, that there can't be any progress. Things won't get better. They might get better very locally. They won't get better in reality as a whole. We'll always be in the same situation. So I just want to finish this video by reading out the last 2 paragraphs of the text, also to give you a little bit of a feel of how it sounds. Moreover, Blanqui writes, so far the past represented barbarity and the future meant progress, science, happiness, illusion. This past has witnessed the disappearance of the most brilliant civilizations on every one of our globe doubles. Right? Our past has already seen the best possible civilizations because everything has already happened, and then they disappeared. Right? They disappeared without a trace, and they will do so again without leaving more of a trace. On billions of Earths, the future will witness the very same ignorance, the very same foolishness, and the very same cruelties of our old ages. At the present hour, the entire life of our planet, from its birth to its death, unfolds day by day on myriads of twin globes with all its crimes and misery. What we call progress is locked up on Earth, on each Earth, and disappears with it. Always and everywhere on the terrestrial camp, the same drama, the same set, on the same narrow stage, a noisy humanity infatuated by its own greatness, thinking itself to be the universe and inhabiting its prison like an immensity, only to drown soon, along with the globe that has borne the burden of its pride with the deepest scorn. The same monotony, the same immobility in the foreign stars. The universe repeats itself endlessly and struts on its legs. Unfazed, eternity plays the same performance in the infinite. So for Blanqui in the end, infinity, which gives room for everything and makes every possibility real, really does not give us a sort of wealth and richness and, everything that we hoped for. It's a prison where nothing can ever change, and we are doomed to repeat forever and ever and ever the same stage play. That's pretty dark.